The Interim, or the birth of history from the spirit of postponement. The term interim not only describes the playing field shared by illusion and hope, it is also reminiscent of the basic shape of Western historical thinking. For what history means in the eminent Occidental sense of the word can only be understood from its nature as time limit and interim. An interim can only exist where an event in time strives for a final goal or a final date from which it can be understood as a deadline. These are precisely the basic features of the late Jewish and Christian perception of history, which is constitutive of Europe as a phenomenon. Few historians have fully conveyed how a large swathe of history has been shaped by the tradition and variation of messianic and eschatological motifs. Not only early Western history, but also modern times, including the recent present. But as for the program of a critique of historical reason, which has been open since Ma and Dilthey, there should be no doubt that messianology, or as it emerged from the Jewish tradition and made history in its Christian variant, must form its core. The messianic perception of history is based on the idea that the long march of peoples through the deserts of time must one day come to an end, when the Messiah completes the alienation era and establishes a final kingdom that does not resemble the current world in any way whatsoever. The Christian version of this model became effective at the moment when Jesus accepted the insinuation of his disciples that he was the Messiah and began to preach the presence of the kingdom of God within him. The two most revealing variants of such a process are provided by Sabbatai Zvai in the 17th and Jiddu Krishnamurti in the 20th century. After the disaster of Golgotha, it became clear that explosive power lay in this process. The possibility of Christian messianism was laid out in the unbearable paradox that the Messiah did not prevail as a world king of end times, but left the scene as a miserable, executed criminal. For the first believers, this scandal could only be surmounted with the proclamation of an imminent return of the Lord in all his glory, visible to all, liberating for the faithful, appalling to adversaries. Thus, at the beginning of the Christian concept of history, world time is transformed into a waiting period, which shrinks the horizon to the small span between the crucifixion and the reappearance of the Messiah. It is from this minimum that the later expansions of the horizon had to emanate, and they were due once the waiting for a return became existentially impossible. The first generation of Christians died with a question to which European history would be the answer. How is the absence of the Messiah to be understood? The very next generation had to learn to expect greater time spans and move the parousia to the time of their grandchildren or great-grandchildren. For them, the question of a Christian's involvement in the business of the world became pressing, and, if not with body and soul, nevertheless with great obligation, as it would be commanded if tomorrow the last judgment came and the final kingdom began. It was in the musings of the early Christians that Western history was put on its very strange trajectory. Back then, patience and hope first entered into a historicizing tension with each other. Never before had hope been so elevated to virtue and aggrandized into religious psychopolitics. It may be said that the Christian revolution set in motion by Paul intervened more deeply in the experience of time in the Old World than any reform of the imperial calendar could ever have. For Paul, too, the time ahead is a terse interim. But its significance is not that of an inconsequential passage. It is a time with its own dignity, insofar as it already stands in the light of salvation by virtue of its message. Consequently, all cosmic and mythical calendars are invalidated. Even with the caveat of the short interim, existence post-Christum stands out as an epoch in its own right, and is as differentiated from the pre-Messianic life of the Jews as it is from the world of the Greeks and Romans. Paul was presumably the first person to live in a hurry as a matter of principle, because it was important to him to fulfill his universally understood mission in the supposedly short period of time given. For him, the content of the mission lies in the revolutionary newness of every life after Christ. The extent to which the epoch-making power of this turning point extends is demonstrated not least by the fact that the present rumours of a post-modernity would be groundless without the Pauline post-antiquity. Without Paul's great success, there would be no Christianity as world religion, and without that, no periodization of history whose dissolution moves contemporary minds. Christianity as a historical religion, however, stands and falls with the awareness that the time between the crucifixion and the return of the Messiah participates in an epochal newness, and thus possesses an objective, redemptive, historical content. If this consciousness had not been effective, the Christian impulse would have been lost in the syncretism of late antiquity after a few generations. The non-return of Christ would have drained the expectation of salvation and deprived the Christian message of any future history-making character. A mystical and symbolist psychotherapeutic would probably have absorbed the Christ legend and dissolved it into a self-redemption theory of an Eastern type. The early history of the Church, which represents a single struggle against the Gnostic temptation of the individual exit from the real history of salvation, shows how powerful the tendencies to such developments were. Only after centuries of wrangling could the real existing Church, as a Catholic one, prevail against the private salvation cults and constitute itself as a political organon of salvation and hope for a new world time. The new era is already developed in the fantastic apostolate of the 13th apostle, who felt expressly called to bring the news of Christ to the peoples of the entire non-Jewish world. In Paul's person, that which will become the historical content of the new world age is crystallized for the first time: the self-transcendence of Judaism. Since then, Christian world time has been substantially an apostolic time for the spread of an exuberant and counter-worldly message, time for the, however contradictory, installation of justice and fraternity in a desert world, time for the instilling of hope into decaying souls, which the war of life had set on a greedy and desperate trajectory. A considerable need for time becomes apparent for this unprecedented mission, as the Christianization of peoples cannot happen overnight. In the light of the missionary idea, the delayed parousia can be understood not only as a disappointment, but also as a salvation-bringing postponement of the end. If the story really eats from the apostolic substance, then the end of days must not come before the universalization of the message. Almost from the very beginning, a Christian thinking about time and history thus contains the contrast between an eschatological, short, and an apostolic, long, determination of the interim within itself. While the eschatological motif constantly reminds us of the closeness of Judgment Day, the apostolic motif keeps the story open as a time of spreading salvation over the inhabited earth. In the struggle between these two poles, the tense time structure of the Christian world age attains its profile. This is the sign of revolutionary impatience as well as conservative continuity, the élan of messianic unrest as well as the inertia of the sacramental establishment, the eschatological readiness for the end of days as well as the anti-eschatological engagement with the temporary. Where the motif of the long story rules in mature comprehensiveness, there the apostolic goal-orientedness of time emerges most clearly. For it is only from the point of the successful outcome of the mission that the connection to world history as total salvation event can be made visible. With his apostolic program for the post-Christian world, Paul became not only the founder of the Christian religion, but also the initiator of the sacred mobilization that has deployed a large part of the psychological and political energy of Europe over the span of millennia. For the modern phase of the Christian West, however, it is characteristic that the eschatological element is increasingly pushed into the background. The idea of history as a time between creation and redemption, or between death and parousia of the Messiah, lost its plausibility in the demarcated horizon of modern troubled history. Christian woe, which no longer even senses its contradiction in terms, begins to arrange itself in a forwardly open continuum. The burdensome thought of a final end is obscured by the philosophy of infinitely perfectible progress. Thus, from the 18th century onwards, Christian ideas against traditional Christianity became paradoxically effective by creating decidedly post-Christian or anti-Christian philosophies of history. It is precisely in the decidedly worldly and atheistic wings of the Enlightenment that the messianic impulse, chastened for a millennium, reawakens to radical offensiveness. It becomes world political violence in Marxism above all, and gives a messianic perspective to modern progressive thought. A perspective back into a beginning from the point of view of an end. The end of the path through the desert of an alienated interim, into the beginning of an era of post-historical fulfillment. It seems that the Christian impulse in modernity reaches a worldly maximum of influence under an atheist, socialist, and humanist incognito. At the same time, it witnesses its irreligious liquidation as well. The present is indeed a time of historical ambiguity. It is typical for it not to be able to decide between religion and irreligion in the same way it can't decide between the proclamation and revocation of progress. Even though Western civilization has undoubtedly entered a post-Christian age, the departure from the Christian era does not entail a departure from its conception of history and its eschatology. On the contrary, one cannot avoid the impression that the eschatological motif of the Judeo-Christian tradition begins to dominate more forcefully in post-Christian times than ever before. The Judeo-Christian apocalyptic lives on in the neo-pagan panic. The end of the Christian world epoch does not mean that the apocalyptic stress is followed by a new cosmological sigh of relief. Only in our grandfather's generation could we buy into the vision of becoming the new Greeks. Up until the eve of National Socialism, it was seductive to think together with Nietzsche that one could emigrate from Christian decadence to pagan health and sacrifice history for the cosmos. Even if, for most contemporaries, Christianity may only be an unreal, citable magnitude, no generation has ever been as distant as today's from the cosmic cycle of the times. Never has the return from linear history to a cyclical order of things been as unlikely as it is now. Of course, anyone who is reeling on the sloping trajectory of natural devastation would like to find safety in a cosmological post-history, where a sovereign, timeless existence prevails. Without a doubt, it would be appealing to settle in a post-Paulinian way, and without illusory hope, as tremendous mortals on the maternal earth. But it is clear that this resettlement is not going to happen, because the world process initiated by Christian hope, as well as by the Greek epistemes, has gone disastrously out of control. There is no real pleasure in living. There seems to be no room left in our countdown for the desirable large cosmic cycles. Chatter about postmodernism bursts into this situation. It drives the dilemma that has been latent for over 100 years to the point where it gets out of hand in an open scandal. As soon as a consciousness comes forward that claims to speak of a postmodern location, modernity is lured out of the reserve by this presumption and forced into the confession that it sees itself as the epoch that no other can follow. Postmodern talk, which at first was only meant to provide a bit of variety, forces modernity to profess to be the end of times. That is, an era that no longer wants to have an interim character, but is crossed over into the enduring presence of an infinitely perfect post-history. For modernity, the mere thought of postmodernism is illegitimate and shocking, because according to its self-image, the successors of modernity must never be anything other than modernity once again. The dull escalator feeling now proves to be a symptom of historico-philosophical significance. According to its basic historical feature, the present is already a small-scale end of times which only has itself in front of it. A postmodern epoch can no longer be created, except in the bad sense that shocking regressions or catastrophes could destroy the entire construct of the modern age. Because modernity is already a secret millennium, burdened with complexes, seen from without it, only the worst can still lead beyond it. This is where we touch on the most anxious point of the contemporary crisis. As long as modernity does not confess that it has established itself discreetly, but relentlessly, as an end-times kingdom, it remains stuck in its claim that after modernity, no other age is permitted to create new epochs. It insists on this claim with an unconscious violence and is plunged into an irresolvable dilemma. On the one hand, modernity can only see the worst as coming after itself. On the other hand, the worst is precisely placed on modernity's own trajectory, which forbids us to leave because it cannot conceive of a possible alternative to it. It can therefore neither reach nor really even imagine a future for itself. If it continues as before, it produces the worst. If it were to cease producing the worst, it would no longer be itself, but something epochally different. But since it literally sees nothing else coming after modernity, it remains condemned to itself. Through its unspoken and uncorrectable belief in itself as the very last era, modernity is fixated on the murky, linear processualism that it inhabits, and the only thing it can see ahead is the postponement of the end, but no longer the possibility of something new. The escalator babble about postmodernism is now becoming expensive. The gallery owners, architects, zeitgeist designers, and cultural editors are losing control of it, and it is rising to become a question of epochs in the exact sense of the word. It puts the epochal quality of the present to the test. Thus the question becomes explicit and undeniable as to whether modernity indeed already has the character of being an end times, or if it is an interim that can be surpassed. In other words, does it still form a section of an open history, or rather already the final formation of the occidental planetary civilizing process? For the busy zeitgeist critics in the media, the problem can also be raised as to whether fashion has already replaced history. Thus the after of after modernity emerges from its cocoon in the last instance as the after of a Western age that is still looking for itself. It is an after that shakes at the prison window bars of the present and gives expression to a doomsday claustrophobia. There, the small talk of postmodernity is done with, and the delicious prefix is just a symptom of panic. It is a powerless postulate that maybe, after the imminent end times which we know ourselves to be caught in, new spans of time would open themselves for a post-historical human existence. Whoever says the word postmodernism just wants to take their neck out of the noose of history. The future prospects of a civilization now hinge on the sense or nonsense of a prefix, and although it was not meant so seriously at first, the involuntary seriousness of the matter has rendered its own reckless origins entirely forgotten. What is at stake here is in fact nothing less than the possibility of a postmodern historicity. In other words, the chance for a post-historical temporality. And yes, such questions do sound like a betrayal of history. The ominous prefix leads its users into historico-philosophical illegitimacy. It seduces us to play with the unimaginable and makes us willing to travel into a future that no longer constitutes modernity, a small after or a tiny post, and the misty outline of a time beyond the end of history emerges from the realm of what has never been before.